Elizabeth Taylor was the only woman on earth whose sorrow was measured in carats. She became a luxury icon of the global jet set, shaped by Hollywood's machinery and relentlessly consumed by the culture of fame. Look closely at the 69-carat diamond on her neck. It wasn't sparkling for happiness, but to hide a jagged surgical scar. These were glittering handcuffs, precious stones used by powerful men to silence her cries after violence and betrayal. This is Elizabeth Taylor, the diamond-encrusted tragedy. To peel back the velvet curtain on Elizabeth's life, we must look at the 1940s. This was the height of the studio system, an era when MGM didn't just produce films. They owned souls. They controlled what actors ate, who they slept with, and how they breathed. Born in London in 1932 to American art dealers, Elizabeth's fate was sealed before she could speak. Her mother, Sarah Southern, was a failed stage actress who viewed her daughter's beauty as a second chance at the fame she never achieved. When the family moved to Los Angeles, Sarah didn't prepare Elizabeth for school. She prepared her for the auction block of the major studios. The American upper class of the post-war era was desperate for icons of excess to distract them from the scars of global conflict. They craved a goddess of vanity. Elizabeth, with her surreal beauty and double eyelashes, was the perfect product. At the age of 10, Elizabeth signed with MGM. From that moment, she ceased to be a child. The studio began the industrialization of her beauty. MGM's grooming department treated her like a diamond in the rough. They plucked her hairline, dictated her diet, and even forced her to wear dental veneers to create a $1 million smile. The cruelty peaked during the filming of National Velvet. To play the girl who wins the Grand National, Elizabeth was pushed to do physically demanding work, and she injured her back during the production. This spinal injury would plague her for 70 years, necessitating dozens of surgeries. But for MGM, a child's lifelong physical agony was a small price to pay for a box office hit. Elizabeth had no peers. Her afternoons were spent in the company of bloated studio executives and wealthy investors who looked at her with the calculating eyes of a jeweler. She was taught to speak and move like an aristocrat, but inside she was a starving soul, desperate for a kind of love that didn't come with a contract attached. By age 16, Elizabeth Taylor was no longer America's little girl. She was so breathtakingly beautiful that men literally gasped in her presence. This is where the pattern becomes clear. The elite didn't love Elizabeth. They merely loved the status her presence conferred upon them. Her mother in the studio orchestrated dates with billionaires, most notably Howard Hughes. Biographers later claimed that Hughes tried to buy access to her with money, reinforcing the idea that powerful men treated her like property. To Hughes, Elizabeth was the Hope Diamond of women, the one piece missing from his collection. Though she refused, the incident solidified a toxic mindset in Elizabeth. Her value was determined by the price men were willing to pay for her. She began to believe that to be loved, she had to be expensive. Jewelry entered her life as a substitute for emotional safety. Whenever she was sad, abandoned, or used, a new stone was placed in her hand. This was the language of the upper class, using wealth to silence the screams of the heart. As the curtain fell on her youth, Elizabeth Taylor had been successfully processed into Hollywood's most valuable asset. She was no longer a girl, but a sovereign territory of glamour, the Queen of Diamonds, presiding over a hollow empire. She possessed every jewel the elite could offer, yet remained tragically bankrupt in the only currency that mattered, a love that wasn't manufactured for the cameras. Her elite positioning pushed her away from humanity. She lived in 5-star hotels, traveled by private rail car, and was surrounded by bodyguards. In this gilded cage, she was a prisoner of her own face. She entered her first marriage with the tragic hope that a man would save her, not realizing that in the eyes of the elite, she was simply the most prestigious trophy ever put on display. We look at old photographs of Elizabeth Taylor and admire that timeless perfection. But if you look closely into those violet eyes, you can see the shadow of a 10-year-old girl screaming to have her childhood back. The first diamonds were already being fitted around her neck, not as jewelry, but as the collar of a ruthless cinematic empire. By 1950, 18-year-old Elizabeth Taylor was desperate. She was tired of MGM controlling her breath. She was tired of her mother, Sarah, choosing her dresses. She wanted to be a woman, not a property. In her youthful naivety, she believed that marriage was the only trapdoor out of the studio's basement. Enter Conrad Nicky Hilton Jr., the handsome polo-plane heir to the Hilton Hotel fortune. On paper, it was the ultimate jet-set union. Hollywood royalty meets the king of hospitality. But for the men involved, Elizabeth was merely a marketing asset. MGM saw the wedding as the greatest promotional stunt for her film, Father of the Bride. Nicky Hilton saw her as the ultimate accessory to decorate his penthouses. The wedding was a spectacle of excess. Elizabeth wore a gown encrusted with seed pearls that took 15 seamstresses 3 months to complete. But as she walked down the aisle, she wasn't walking toward love. She was being handed from one owner to another. The diamonds she wore that day were the first glittering handcuffs. The honeymoon was the moment the luxury item thesis became a brutal reality. On a 3-month luxury cruise across Europe, the world saw photos of a radiant couple on the decks of grand ocean liners. The reality? Nicky Hilton was a gambling addict with a violent streak. He didn't want a wife, he wanted a statue. When Elizabeth spoke, he felt her imperfections ruin the image. When she cried, he grew bored. He would spend nights at the baccarat tables in Monte Carlo, leaving the world's most beautiful woman alone in a hotel room, surrounded by trunks of designer clothes she had no one to wear for. It was during this time that the deep thesis of Elizabeth's life solidified. Wealth is a tool used to bury trauma. After Nicky would verbally abuse her or vanish for days, he would return not with an apology, but with a piece of jewelry. This was the conditioning of the super rich. I hurt you, so here is a stone to buy your silence. Elizabeth began to associate physical pain with the cold touch of gold. She was being consumed by the Hilton brand, her identity slowly dissolving into the role of a mistreated trophy. The marriage lasted only 8 months, but the damage was permanent. During one of Nicky's drunken rages, Elizabeth suffered a miscarriage. It was a private agony hidden beneath a public veneer of irreconcilable differences. She returned to Hollywood not as a girl, but as a cynical woman who realized that men were attracted to her carat value rather than her soul. She had been used by the Hilton dynasty to add glamour to their hotels, and then discarded when she proved to have a human heart that bled. However, the public didn't see the blood. They only saw the jewelry she kept. The press began to portray her as a materialistic siren. The world started to believe that Elizabeth Taylor lived for diamonds, not realizing that for her, those diamonds were the only things that didn't hit her or leave her. They were her armor of the upper class. In her rebound, Elizabeth sought the opposite of the volatile Nicky Hilton. She married Michael Wilding, a British actor 20 years her senior. This was her attempt to find stability within the old money British aesthetic. But even here, she was a vat of luxury being drained. Wilding's career was fading, and Elizabeth became the primary breadwinner. She was no longer just a trophy, she was a bank. She worked grueling hours at the studio to maintain their lavish lifestyle, the villas, the servants, the expectations of the elite. She was a mobile economy. Her face paid for the champagne and the private cars. Yet, the more she provided, the more her husbands resented her. It was a paradox of the super successful woman in the 1950s. She had to be the most beautiful object in the room, but also the most productive machine in the industry. Just as Elizabeth was settling into a life of quiet, expensive boredom, with Wilding, she met the man who would redefine her relationship with excess, Mike Todd. Todd was a high-stakes gambler, a Broadway producer, and a man who lived at a volume most people couldn't survive. He didn't just give Elizabeth jewelry, he gave her statements. He once bought her a diamond tiara, telling her, "You're my queen, and you should have a crown." For the first time, Elizabeth felt that someone celebrated her luxuriousness rather than trying to stifle it. But Mike Todd was also a man who understood the power of the brand. He used Elizabeth as the center of the most extravagant parties in history, events where 18,000 guests were served champagne and gifts. Elizabeth was the sun around which his empire of excess orbited. But as we know with Icarus, those who fly too close to the sun on private jets often face a catastrophic fall. By the mid-1950s, Elizabeth Taylor had perfected the art of high society armor. She knew that if she wore enough emeralds, the cameras wouldn't see the circles under her eyes. She knew that if she arrived in a Rolls Royce, the world wouldn't ask about her crumbling mental health. She had become the ultimate jet-set icon. She was the woman women wanted to be, and the woman men wanted to own. But the price of this positioning was a total loss of privacy. She was a commodity traded on the stock exchange of public opinion. Every diamond was a headline. Every heartbreak was a profit margin for the tabloids. The clock ticked toward a fateful night in 1958. Elizabeth stood on a balcony gazing at a 29-carat diamond from Mike Todd, the only stone that ever made her feel like a person rather than property. For a fleeting moment, the Queen of Diamonds felt safe. By 1958, the fairy tale of excess was about to collide with physics, and no amount of money could negotiate with gravity. The ultimate luxury item was about to learn that all the wealth in the world is weightless against the winds of tragedy. In March 1958, the gilded cage was incinerated. Mike Todd, the man who had treated Elizabeth like a queen and gifted her a tiara just for a Saturday afternoon, died when his private plane, the Lucky Liz, crashed in New Mexico. Taylor was not on board the plane when it crashed, but the loss shattered her. A bout of pneumonia had kept her grounded, the first of many times her fragile health would, ironically, save her life while breaking her heart. The aftermath was a grotesque display of upper-class mourning. Elizabeth was a 26-year-old widow with 3 children, surrounded by millions of dollars in art and gems, yet she was utterly alone. The world watched her grief with a predatory fascination, but in the circles of the jet set, grief is never allowed to be quiet. It must be performative. It must be draped in black silk and hidden behind oversized Dior sunglasses. In her paralyzing sorrow, Elizabeth turned to the only person who understood her world, Mike Todd's best friend, the singer, Eddie Fisher. The problem? Eddie was married to Debbie Reynolds, America's sweetheart. When the affair went public, the story turned darker. The public felt entitled to judge her as if they owned her. The public, who had worshipped her beauty, now felt they owned the right to judge her morality. She was branded a homewrecker. In the 1950s, a woman's social currency was tied to her reputation. Elizabeth's stock plummeted in the eyes of the common crowd, but in the eyes of the elite, she became even more fascinating. She was the dark goddess, the woman who could have any man she wanted regardless of the cost. Elizabeth's response to the backlash was characteristic of her armor. She married Eddie Fisher in Las Vegas, and the marriage was marked with diamonds rather than apologies. It was as if she were saying, "If the world thinks I'm a villain, I will at least be a well-decorated one." In 1960, Elizabeth Taylor broke the back of the Hollywood studio system. She demanded and received a $1 million salary to play Cleopatra. Adjusted for inflation, it was an unprecedented sum. She was now more than an actress. She was a sovereign state. The production moved to Rome, the heart of the Dolce Vita era. It was here that Elizabeth met Richard Burton. Their chemistry was not a slow burn. It was a nuclear explosion. Burton was a Shakespearean titan, a man of old world intellect and new world appetites. Both were married to others, but they began an affair so blatant and so extravagant that it shifted the Earth's cultural axis. They lived in a world of mobile luxury. They rented entire floors of the Grand Hotel, filled them with crates of Jack Daniels, and spent their days on the Olivia, a 120-foot yacht. They were the ultimate jet-set predators, consuming everything in their path. But the stress of the scandal and the grueling filming nearly killed her. Elizabeth contracted a near-fatal case of pneumonia once more. In March 1961, while Cleopatra was still filming in England, she nearly died of pneumonia and required an emergency tracheotomy. When she finally emerged from the hospital, she had a permanent, jagged scar on her throat. For the goddess of love, this was a catastrophic blemish. Her solution? The legendary jewelry collection. From that day on, she wore necklaces of such immense size and brilliance, like the Bulgari emeralds, that no one would ever look at the scar. The jewelry wasn't just vanity. It was a tactical camouflage for her physical brokenness. The scandal reached such a fever pitch that the Vatican's official newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, published a letter condemning Elizabeth for erotic vagrancy. The condemnation painted her as immoral and unfit by the standards of the era, and it intensified the global backlash. This was the ultimate historical controversy. Was Elizabeth a victim of a patriarchal society that punished a woman for her desires? Or was she a spoiled luxury item who believed her wealth made her exempt from morality? The truth lay in the middle. Elizabeth was a woman who had been manufactured to be desired, and when she finally desired something for herself, the world turned on her. Yet this scandal was the engine that powered the global media for years. The paparazzi, the paparazzo, was a term coined during this exact era in Rome, followed her every move. Her fame became a revenue stream. Magazines, studios, and tabloids all cashed in on her image. In 1969, Richard Burton bought a 69-carat pear-shaped diamond for Elizabeth, outbidding Cartier at an auction. It became known as the Taylor-Burton diamond. This diamond became a symbol of the bargain her life kept forcing on her: pain, followed by expensive apologies. Burton didn't just buy it out of love. Their relationship was a cycle of violence and diamonds. They would have screaming matches that destroyed hotel suites, followed by Burton buying his way back into her grace with a stone. The diamond was so large it had to be worn as a pendant because it was too heavy for her finger. It hung directly over her tracheotomy scar. It was the ultimate handcuff, a shimmering multi-million-dollar weight that kept her anchored to a volatile, alcoholic man, because she had become addicted to the high of his excessive apologies. She was a woman exhausted by her own glamour. By the end of the Cleopatra era, Elizabeth Taylor had destroyed the old way of being a star. She had proven that a woman could be more powerful than a studio, more talked about than a war, and more controversial than a religion. She had become the high priestess of the jet set. She lived in a bubble of diamonds and duels, where the only thing that mattered was the next stone and the next glass of champagne. But beneath the 69-carat sparkle, the woman who had been owned by MGM and owned by Hilton was now being owned by the world's expectations of her. The scene fades on the deck of a yacht drifting across the Mediterranean. Elizabeth is draped in emeralds, a drink in one hand, and a cigarette in the other, the image of a woman who has everything. But the cameras miss the tremors in her hands and the bottle of pills hidden in her silk purse. The ultimate luxury item was beginning to realize that you can't eat diamonds and you cannot use them to fill a soul hollowed out by a lifetime of being consumed. By the mid-1970s, the jet set era was losing its luster, and so was the woman who defined it. Elizabeth Taylor was no longer the ingenue of National Velvet or the siren of Cleopatra. She was entering her 40s, a dangerous age for a woman whose entire value had been predicated on the perfection of her physical form. The deep thesis of Elizabeth's life now took a darker, more internal turn. As her beauty began to mature, the men who had sought her as a trophy began to treat her with the casual neglect one shows to an aging masterpiece. The mobile economy was slowing down. Her relationship with Richard Burton, a saga of diamonds and bruises, had finally fractured. They divorced, remarried in a remote African village, and divorced again within a year. Burton's final gifts were not tokens of affection, but peace offerings for a war that could no longer be won. The jewelry grew larger as the love grew smaller. It was during this era that Elizabeth's dependence on armor became a medical necessity. The more she suffered from the rejection of a world that only wanted her young and radiant, the more she retreated into the cold, unyielding comfort of her gemstones. Elizabeth Taylor's body was a map of 20th century medical trauma. The spinal injury from her childhood stunts, the emergency tracheotomy in Rome, and the years of heavy drinking and pill popping had left her a fragile beauty. There is a haunting anecdote from this period. Elizabeth would check into hospitals under assumed names, such as Ellis Todd, to hide from the paparazzi. In these sterile rooms, away from the flashbulbs, she was not the Queen of Hollywood. She was a woman in a hospital gown, wrestling with chronic, agonizing back pain. Yet even in the hospital, the luxury never left her. Friends noted that she would have her jewelry brought to her bedside. She would sit in bed, draped in millions of dollars of Bulgari and Cartier, while hooked up to an IV drip. This became a pattern. The sicker she felt, the more jewelry she wore. The gems were her only constant. Husbands lied, studios sued, and her body failed. But the Krupp diamond was always 33 carats of unwavering truth. It was her way of telling the nurses, the doctors, and herself, I am still Elizabeth Taylor. I am still valuable. In 1976, Elizabeth married John Warner, a politician aiming for the U.S. Senate. This was her attempt to pivot from Hollywood royalty to political dignitary, an attempt to find a new kind of elite positioning. However, the transition was a disaster. The goddess of love was expected to be a silent, supportive political wife in Virginia. She was the consumed luxury item in a new way. She was used to attract donors and voters, then tucked away in a drafty farmhouse while Warner campaigned. She turned to food and alcohol for comfort. When she gained weight, the press, the same press she had fed with her scandals for 30 years, turned on her with a cruelty that was visceral. They called her Elizabeth Taylor Maid, mocking her size. This was the ultimate historical controversy, the public's refusal to allow a female icon to age or to be human. She was a luxury item that had become damaged goods in the eyes of the consumerist society she helped create. In 1983, Elizabeth Taylor did something no superstar of her magnitude had ever done. She admitted she was a junkie. she checked herself into the Betty Ford Center for Drug and Alcohol Addiction. This was the moment the backstage shadows were finally brought into the light. She was exhausted by her own glamour. She admitted that the diamonds had been silencing her pain for decades. In the clinic, they made her scrub floors and share a room with strangers. For the first time since she was 10 years old, she wasn't a property or a queen. She was just Elizabeth. This was the beginning of her personal story and emotional impact. She realized that the jet-set lifestyle had been a slow-motion suicide. The private jets and the champagne were just a high-speed chase away from herself. When she emerged, she was still wearing the rings, but the woman beneath them had finally started to heal the scars that no necklace could cover. In 1984, the news broke. Richard Burton was dead. He had died of a brain hemorrhage at age 58. Elizabeth was devastated. She did not attend the funeral at the request of Burton's widow to avoid turning it into a media spectacle, and she later visited his grave in private. She wore the jewelry he gave her until her dying day, but after his death, the pieces changed meaning. They were no longer handcuffs or peace offerings. They became ghosts. Every time the light hit the Taylor Burton diamond, it reflected a man she had loved and fought with in a cycle of epic excess. She realized that the super rich had everything, except for the one thing they actually needed: more time. The journey of her middle years teaches us that the armor of the upper class is ultimately a lie. Using wealth to mask the wreckage of the soul only makes the wounds fester. Elizabeth's public struggle with her weight, her health, and her addiction was simply the physical manifestation of a woman who had been overconsumed by a world that never knew when to stop taking. She remained relevant, not because she was perfect, but because she was a survivor. She was the first celebrity to publicly struggle with the ugly side of life, addiction and aging, and she did it with the same ferocity with which she had once ruled the red carpet. In her Bel Air mansion, 50-year-old Elizabeth stands alone before a mirror. She stares at her reflection, the jagged tracheotomy scar, the tired skin, and the violet eyes that have witnessed too much betrayal. Reaching into her jewelry box, she pulls out a massive solitary emerald. She fastens it around her neck, not as a peace offering for a husband or a gimmick for a studio, but as a tribute to her own survival. The ultimate luxury item was finally reclaiming its own value, learning at last that her brilliance came from within, not from the stones that sought to outshine her. By the mid-1980s, the world of the jet set was changing. A shadow was falling over the glamorous parties and the Hollywood hills, a shadow called AIDS. For decades, Elizabeth Taylor had lived as a luxury icon, but in 1985, the death of her dear friend and co-star Rock Hudson shattered the glass of that protected world. The deep thesis of her life underwent its final, most radical transformation. Elizabeth realized that her elite positioning gave her a weapon that no politician or doctor possessed: unbreakable visibility. While the world's leaders stayed silent out of fear and prejudice, the Queen of Diamonds stepped into the light. She realized that the same public that had consumed her scandals for 40 years could now be forced to look at a tragedy they wanted to ignore. Elizabeth didn't just lend her name to the cause, she gave it her soul. She founded the American Foundation for AIDS Research, AMFAR, and the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation. This was the personal story and emotional impact at its peak. She traveled to the halls of Congress, dripping in diamonds and wearing high-fashion silk, to demand funding for a disease that the Reagan administration was too afraid to name. There is a powerful historical anecdote from this time. She was told that her glamorous image didn't fit the grim reality of the epidemic. Her response was fierce. If I don't use my fame for this, then my fame was for nothing. She used her jewelry as a bait and switch. People came to see the goddess of love and her legendary stones, but they left having heard a lecture on compassion and science. She turned her armor of the upper class into a shield for the dying. She was no longer being consumed by the public. She was leading them. In her later years, Elizabeth's relationship with her jewelry changed. She no longer needed the glittering handcuffs to feel secure. She began to see her collection as a stewardship rather than ownership. She famously said, "I am merely the temporary custodian of these beautiful things." This was a profound shift from her younger self, who used gems as a way to silence her pain. One of the most moving acts of her final years was selling the Taylor Burton diamond, the stone that had been a symbol of her volatile, erotic vagrancy with Richard Burton, was sold to fund the construction of a hospital in Botswana. She was literally turning the vanity of her past into the survival of others. The luxury item was being recycled into hope. She realized that while carats are forever, human life is fragile, and the former must serve the latter. Elizabeth Taylor spent much of her final decade in a wheelchair, her body worn down by decades of illness and more than 30 surgeries. Yet, she never let the image fail. When she appeared in public, she was still a vision of violet-eyed splendor. There is a hidden story from her final days in the hospital in 2011. Even as she struggled for breath, she made sure she was wearing her jewelry. It wasn't about vanity anymore. It was about dignity. She was a queen until the very last second. She died at age 79, surrounded by her children and, yes, her diamonds. But the historical controversy of her life was finally settled. She wasn't just a homewrecker or a spoiled star. She was the first modern celebrity to understand that great privilege carries a great debt. She paid that debt in full, using the very luxury that had once imprisoned her to buy freedom for others. The lasting significance of Elizabeth Taylor is not found in the $150 million her estate brought at auction or the 8 marriage certificates. It is found in the fact that she survived the most brutal manufacturing process in history, the Hollywood studio system, and emerged with her humanity intact. She remains relevant because she is the ultimate lesson in the fragile beauty of the human experience. She taught us that we can be damaged, we can be scandalous, and we can be broken, but we can still be brilliant. Like a diamond, she was formed under immense pressure and heat, and like a diamond, she was indestructible. Elizabeth Taylor's life was a journey from being a thing to being a human. She was born as a studio property, grew into a billionaire's trophy, and died as a world-changing humanitarian. Her sorrow measured in diamonds was real, but so was her courage. She proved that you can wear a 69-carat stone to cover a scar, but you only become truly beautiful when you use that stone to heal someone else's wound. The Queen of Diamonds is gone, but the light she reflected, the light of compassion, resilience, and unapologetic living, continues to shine far brighter than any jewel in her vault. She was the ultimate luxury, not because of what she cost, but because of what she gave. Elizabeth Taylor famously requested that she be late for her own funeral, and she was 15 minutes late. It was her final jet-set flourish, a reminder that she marched to her own beat, wore her own stones, and lived a life that was too big for any one box. She was, and always will be, the woman who proved that even in a gilded cage, a bird can still learn to fly and lead the whole world to a better place.